Today we're going to talk about the varieties of Australian English. People really like to take note of how homogeneous Australian English is compared to how big Australia is. You look at a similarly sized country like the US, and you think there's hundreds of different dialects of American English, and yet there's basically only a handful of Australian dialects. And then you look at England, which is itty bitty, and they've got all sorts of different varieties. And so Australian English is very weirdly homogeneous, and people often take note of this. But I honestly think it's a little unfair. The reason for Australian English's homogeneity is its youth. Sure, we've got like 100 different varieties of American English, but if you look at the literature of people writing about American English, you hear a lot of people saying that it's completely homogeneous, that the whole country only has one dialect of English. You hear people saying that until about the mid-1700s, maybe around 1800. And also take into account, Australian English only really diverged from British English in the late 1800s. The first reports of a distinctive Australian accent are in that diphthongal chain shift that also happened in Cockney English in about the 1880s or 1890s. In Australia, there's just been less time for English to diverge than there has been in America or England. With that being said though, there are still definitely varieties of Australian English that people like to take note of. The main three that you hear over and over and over and over and over again are Cultivated, General, and Broad. If you listen to any YouTube video that goes in depth to Australian accents, you'll hear the distinction between Broad, General, and Cultivated being brought up. But there's a problem with that. You would expect when a dialect is divided into subdialects that these divisions would reflect how people actually think about the dialect. But that doesn't carry across to the three-way division of Australian English. Look at me, pink hair, pink lemonade, I'm so woke. There's a big continuum between general accents and broad accents, and there's no real border between them. And meanwhile, if you look at a cultivated Australian accent, who the fuck talks with a cultivated Australian accent? I've never met a single person in my entire life who talks with anything even resembling a cultivated Australian accent. The only people I have met who talk with a cultivated Australian accent are British. They've come over from England with their family and they still talk with half an English accent. That's all that cultivated Australian is, it's just half of an English accent. And the situation gets even more dire when you find out where this classic tripartite division actually comes from. It comes from a single 1965 study by Mitchell and Delbridge. They were the first to divide Australian English into broad, general, and cultivated. And in the paper, they even say that they're not certain that the classification is accurate. On top of that, this tripartite classification has never actually been tested against, statistics, actual phonological evaluation of Australian English, how Australians actually perceive the different dialects. It's not been tested against anything like that. It was published in one paper, and it was kind of the first division of Australian English we'd ever seen, so everyone was just like, yeah, looks good to me, she'll be right. And now it's just repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated and accepted as general fact, even though it's probably not accurate. In the first place, it feels weird to divide an accent into three parts, two parts of which make up 99% of the speakers, and the third part makes up 1%. That just feels wrong. You can't look at that and not suspect that there must be more internal variation within the 99%. And there is. The broad general cultivated distinction does not take into account Aboriginal dialects, for example, which are not only completely different from any of those three in most places and most demographics, but also have massive internal variation between them. And maybe in the 1960s there were more people who spoke with cultivated Australian English, but it's the 2020s now. It's been 58 years since that study was published, and it's dog shit now. Since 1991, there's been a much better classification floating around, which divides Australian English into general, Aboriginal or Indigenous, and Ethnocultural or Multicultural. There's a few names for the ethnic one. So for the purposes of this video, I've divided Australian English into 5 categories. We've got Cultivated, which is like fucking 10 people at this point, General, Broad, Indigenous Australian, and Ethnocultural, which is still very indefined on its own. Let's go through them one by one and look at their features. Here is a sample of someone speaking with a cultivated Australian accent.
Most people aren't aware of it, but 1975 was, I think, the only year since the migration program began when more people left Australia than came to Australia.
Cultivated Australian has a perceptible and almost palpable amount of British influence.
Something I forgot to mention when I was first recording this video is the reason that Cultivated Australian English has so much British influence. Please excuse how much I look like a
drowned rat.
Right now, I've got COVID, so I'm slumming it on the couch. In the past, Australia and England used to have much closer ties than they do now, up until about halfway through the 20th century. And in Australia, a British accent was considered, it was considered prestigious. It was considered correct English. And after that, Australia came to embrace its own idiosyncratic English as Australian English. We stopped trying to imitate British English and started to just accept our own Australian English for what it was. And this often came into education as well. We used to consider British English to be the standard, and Australian schools used to try, the more posh Australian schools used to try and teach kids to speak received pronunciation, just like posh schools in England used to. And so it follows that Cultivated Australian English has a lot of influence from RP. It's sort of like a halfway point between received pronunciation and general Australian English. But as our ties to England have dissolved over the years, so too has any desire for an English-sounding accent, because having a British accent no longer holds any prestige.
And that leads us nicely to the connotations that this accent holds. You might think that an accent with the name Cultivated would have high prestige, and indeed, in the professional and business world, there's certainly a degree of prestige that comes with a cultivated accent. But if you're just talking normally to some rando in a pub and you talk with a cultivated Australian accent, the rando is not going to want to talk to you. The assumption by most people is that they're putting on the accent. They couldn't have possibly inherited something that sounds so silly. Australians will think that you're trying to be perceived as better than everyone else, that you believe you're better than everyone else, and so they'll think you're a cunt. And so the cultivated accent, even though you'd expect it to hold a high level of prestige, in day-to-day life, it's actually frowned upon. It's actually stigmatized by most people. And it's definitely dying out. It's the most endangered dialect out of the 5 that I've chosen. We next move on to general. The usual, what you hear in the average Australian TED Talk. The general accent from, place to place throughout Australia varies a little bit. In Melbourne, they've got the celery-salary merger. In Perth, people say here instead of here. But on the whole, most of the variation is really subtle. And you have to have heard a lot of different people from a lot of different places to be able to tell the different cities apart. It's not like America where you can listen to someone from the East Coast and someone from the West Coast and immediately tell the differences. In Australia, you've really got to listen for the differences. A lot of people I know say they can tell the difference between someone from Carnarvon and someone from Meekatharra, or like someone from Brisbane and someone from Melbourne. But honestly, apart from big things like the celery-salary merger, I really struggle to tell the difference between the general varieties. Next up, we've got broad.
And you're looking at your little dog, and we were talking about the tennis ball, that's as awkward as a rude dog fucking a tennis ball. And that's the language we use. We swear a lot. And I believe, after reading up all sorts of stuff, they reckon the more a person swears, the more honest they are.
Broad Australian English simultaneously has the most divergent features from Standard English, whatever that is, and also some of the most conservative within Australian English. I've spoken about this in my video on the minutiae of Australian English, but there's certain, diphthongs are flatter in broad Australian English. So mouth will often sound like mouth. You all know and love broad Australian English. It's the classic bogan accent. Again, just like cultivated Australian English, there's a split in how broad Australian English is perceived between the business and economic world and the real world. In the business and economic and job interview world, broad Australian English is generally frowned upon. It holds connotations of lower income, less education, etc., etc., etc. And if you go into a job interview, you don't want to talk with a broad accent. But mainstream Australian culture honestly holds a reverence for broad accents. Shit like Steve-O and Crocodile Dundee, all of our big national heroes have broad accents. You've got the classic true blue Aussie culture. There's this big disparity in how broad Australian English is perceived between normal people and in the pop culture world and in the business world. Next up, we've got Ethnocultural.
You know what? I've been working on it for a little bit, but
Yep.
I only had like a week to film it and do everything, so it was a bit of a rush. But you can watch it on YouTube.
Well, you know what? I've got a little bit of a story about that. I was on Tinder, and I met somebody, and my girlfriend did a face search, and it came up that he gave me a fake name, and he's got a girlfriend.
But I was on a Qantas flight, right, which is traditionally considered a white flight. And I was sitting on the window seat, right, and an elderly Chinese lady, she walks up to the front of the plane, and I knew could only be for me.
Ethnocultural Australian English tends to be a sort of combination of whatever substrate language, whatever immigrants we're talking about here, whatever substrate language they spoke in their heritage, and broad Australian English. It's definitely got its own features, it's definitely distinct, but at the same time it's in flux, and it's a really new dialect. But overall, ethnocultural Australian English is pretty ill-defined, and it's not really developed fully yet. It's still in flux, it's got random... Because, of course, immigrants come from all over the place, and they've got all different substrate features that are still in the boiling pot, working together, coming up with new things and dissolving away and whatnot. There's still a lot of change happening in this dialect, and so maybe come back in a few decades and see how it looks then. And we've got the last one, and my personal favourite, which feels weird to say, but still, it's my favourite, Indigenous Australian English.
There's language all around you. Everything we see has language. Everything that moves has language. All the food source and waters, rivers, they all have names. And that's how we can describe what it is.
This is kind of like broad Australian English, but it's a million times more conservative. It holds a bunch of really old features that are hardly heard anymore, everything from vocabulary to phonology. Across Indigenous Australian English, there's sort of a continuum within that sub-dialect from Creole, English mixed with various Aboriginal languages, all the way to broad Australian English or general Australian English or even cultivated Australian English with hints of Aboriginal Australian English.
Daddy lang heaven, your name in probably high bala. And marabat no one anybody gotta use him your name not bala way.
Yeah, I moved in here last year. Other families living in one house, maybe 20 in one house, or 15 in another. Some living outside.
If I joined the police service, that I might be able to change those certain situations where, instead of a person being arrested, that they could be dealt with in a different way.
Would you agree to say that due to some of the industry and emissions and impacts of those emissions today, it's in direct threat now to some of our very Ngara culture and histories in that effect?
In more broad Aboriginal accents, there's a metric shit ton, as opposed to an imperial shit ton of substrate features that are really interesting to listen to. And of course there's heaps of internal variation between Aboriginal dialects. For one thing, you've got people with broader dialects, maybe who live in more rural areas compared to Aboriginal people living in the city. And then you've got people from one end of Australia compared to the other. Compared to mainstream Australian English, there's a lot more geographic variation in Aboriginal English. And you've got some really interesting variation too. Like you've got a rhotic Australian dialect near Adelaide, which is spoken by Aboriginal people. Up until recently, you had Cape Barren English spoken in the Furneaux Islands, which was insane. And I'm going to make a video on it later on, but there's a lot of research that needs to go into it. It's that crazy. So now we've talked about the different classifications of Australian English. Now I'm going to go over variation in vocabulary. The most distinctive thing about Australian English that really I'm not going to spend too much time on is its abbreviations. We abbreviate shit so much that companies in Australia have adopted their abbreviated name as their real, only name. McDonald's is abbreviated as Macca's so much that the little phone app that you order your meals on before you get to the restaurant is called My Macca's. McDonald's fully embraces its Australian abbreviation into Macca's, because in a country that's hostile to American influence, what better way to get Australians to love you than to pretend you are Australian? In recent years, our habit of abbreviating shit and adding O or Y onto the end has died out a little bit, but it still lives on. Even if that method of abbreviation of adding a little suffix on the end after shortening a word basically to nothing, even if that method of abbreviation isn't really productive anymore, we've still got all those words that were made from that method that we still use in day-to-day life. Arvo, servo, shit like that. But aside from that, stereotypical method of abbreviation, we've got new forms of abbreviation coming along too. Probably gets abbreviated to probs, shit like that. Young Australians in particular are extremely influenced by internet slang. Basically anything that shows up on TikTok as slang is bound to find its way into Australian youth culture within a month. And going off of that, in recent years there's been a lot of American influence, and some American vocabulary has overtaken the pre-existing Australian vocabulary. Most Australians still say mate and bloke fairly regularly, But the Australian bloke, the classic Australian bloke, is being massively supplanted in younger generations by more American words like guy. And same thing with words like mate being supplanted by words like buddy. Of course, this has been happening for centuries. You know, the classic Australian word bush to describe the outback or any rural area comes from American English in the first place. But it's definitely ramped up in recent decades as we've got more and more American media coming into our country. Now, within Australian slang, there is some regional variation. A good example is how some people, I say bathers, but other people from different cities say togs, others say swimmers, others say, trunks. Here's an interesting thing. More broad varieties of Australian English have a lot more loan words from Aboriginal languages. So like yakka, for example, hard yakka, that's hard work. That comes from some East Coast language. My dad grew up working with Yamajis in the Midwest on like stations and shit when he was young. And he uses like a shit ton of Aboriginal, Yamaji loan words to describe mainly aminals and aminals. Mainly animals and places. Yeah, fucking aminals. I'm an educational YouTuber. I talked about this in one of my first videos, but words like ballet and bangara, very, regional, Indigenous loan words there a lot. You find a lot of shit like that in broad accents. There's also words that are more unique to Australian Aboriginal English that sort of come over into broad Australian English, despite not being Indigenous loan words. With like yarn being, a story or something like that, or a long talk of some kind. The whole thing is you tend to hear more lexical crossover between broad Australian English and Aboriginal Australian English than with any other dialect. And that goes into the territory of Aboriginal loan words too. Tasmania is a particularly interesting example of a little area that's got some very unique vocabulary. I suspect it might be dying out in younger generations due to, the internet, massive dialect flattening. You got a lot of words that come from England that used to be sort of archaic or dialectal that became the norm in Tasmania and then died out everywhere else. And at the same time, you got a lot of Aboriginal loan words too. Like you've got stuff like calling a cigarette a tissue, calling any sort of soft drink or fizzy drink cordial, which is insane. You've got the adjective cranky to be kind of like, not just, angry like most of us use it today, but also to mean just kind of weird or odd. And you've also got Aboriginal loan words like lubra, I think is a loan word which means an Aboriginal woman. I don't actually know if that's offensive or not. It might be, so I excuse myself if it is. My personal favourite weird archaic expression is one for like a little rascal kid that needs to be whooped, which is an old-fashioned concept. So excuse me if that doesn't sit right with you, but it's a relatively common thing in older Australian culture. The name for like a rascal kid in Tasmania is anointer. It comes from someone who deserves anointing, which doesn't make a lick of fucking sense. Like, why would you say that someone needs anointing? Anointing used to mean, in colonial times, thrashing. And so you got that word anointing, which used to mean thrashing, and then people called people who needed a good thrashing, they called them anointers. And then that sort of carried on into modern day, even though thrashing's long gone, where you've got people calling rascal little fucking shithead kids anointers, which is, I find that so interesting. The last thing I'm going to tell you about before I pack up for the night and have some dinner is something that you might not expect if you're not from Australia. And even if you are from Australia, or if you're younger, you probably don't know this. The word echidna is a relatively recent introduction to Australian vocabulary. Most people around Australia all had different names for what we today call an echidna, and they still survive in older people today, especially in rural areas. For example, in my part of the world, in my neck of the woods, as they say, it's common for older people, and especially Aboriginal people, to call an echidna a porcupine. When people first started coming to that region of Australia around the late 1800s, regardless of whether echidna had been scientifically described and given a scientific name yet, people seeing echidnas for the first time didn't know what the fuck they were, so they just called them what they knew, which was porcupines. It's a common thing in Australia where people have gotten names for European animals and sort of thrown them onto Australian animals that are completely different. The best example is a magpie. In England, a magpie is a little dude about this big that's just, black and white and doesn't do any harm. In Australia, a magpie is a dude that's about this big and is black and white and does a shit ton of harm. Fucking kills you. Fucking swoops out of the sky. Fucking you're gone. It doesn't actually happen. Magpies don't actually kill people, but it's a common threat in Australia. So the name magpie is really shit to apply to this animal, but people first come to Australia, didn't know what to call it, looked like a magpie, they called it a magpie. It's not a magpie, but they call it a magpie. Again, Tasmania manages to be weird here because they call echidnas badgers. Anyway, I've been talking about Australian accents for so long that my voice actually hurts, so I'm going to stop recording now and come back later talking about phonology, my favourite aspect. I finally slept and had dinner. I actually made myself breakfast a few minutes ago, but I forgot about it, so it's just sitting there getting cold. There's a lot of phonological variation within Australian dialects, not just between broad, general, Aboriginal, whatever like that, but also geographically between different cities and states. The most well-documented thing that varies geographically in Australia is the trap bath split. There was this study done, I think in the 90s by some person, which fucking didn't include Perth for some fucking reason, but included all the other state capitals, so fuck you, random scientist. But basically the study looked at all the different state capitals in Australia and looked at how the trap bath split was distributed between all of them. Australia was invaded and colonised by British people right around the time that the trap bath split was developing, and so you see in different cities across Australia that were colonised at different times, you see the trap bath split in different sort of stages of progression. Perth was established and settled in the early to mid-1800s by mainly a combination of convicts and people coming over to the New World for an exciting new life. Adelaide was settled a few decades later, and I think it had a lower convict population, so there was a higher distribution of wealthy people coming to Adelaide than there was to Perth. Then you got fucking Hobart. I'm pretty sure the explanation is that Hobart had more settlers from Scotland and the north of England, but I don't actually know. Either way, across these three cities, you get an interesting difference in the extent of the trap bath split. In Perth, you'd say castle dance. In Adelaide, you'd say castle dance. And in Hobart, you'd say castle dance. You can see how different cities across Australia have different progressions of the trap bath split due to their histories. Now, I talked about this in my video on the minutiae of Australian English. It's the rhoticization of the goat vowel. Jeff Lindsay done a video on it, go check him out. What I found interesting is the distribution of this sound change, which seems to be limited to young'uns on the east coast. I live in Perth and I'm fucking surrounded by people my age because obviously I am, and I've only ever heard really, I mean, it's difficult to really hear the difference between goat and goat. It's a very subtle difference, so I can't say that I really look for it, but I've only ever noticed one of my friends who's the same age as me doing it. Whereas over east, where most Australians come from, it seems to be a much more common sound change. Another thing that varies geographically is L vocalization. I'm pretty sure it's more common in West Australia and South Australia. Another geographic thing is the diphthongization of the near vowel. In Perth, people tend to say near, and it tends, I don't know if it's really, it can vary between near, and near, with two syllables. Only when the ear vowel is at the end of a word though. People say here, but they won't say here's. Then you've got the classic Melbourne celery-salary merger, where the dress and trap vowels merge before the letter L. I don't know if they merge to a trap vowel or to a dress vowel. I think it could vary, but it means that they either pronounce celery as salary or salary as celery. There's a few things unique to broader accents as well. The word the has two forms in standard English. It has the and the. And the way it's supposedly used is that you say the before a vowel, so you say the apple, but you say the before a consonant, so the car, the apple, the car. But what a lot of more broad Australian accents do, especially in WA, is they say the apple instead of the apple. They just use the weak version of the. They just use the universally, regardless of whatever the standard rule is.
Until the age of 20.
Aboriginal accents have a whole heap of fascinating features. I'm going to make a video on Aboriginal Australian English sooner or later, but it's going to be great. It's going to be so interesting. It holds a lot of substrate features. For example, a lot of fricatives get stopped, especially in more broad rural accents, because there's almost no Indigenous Australian languages which have fricatives. Most of the time, if you find a fricative, it's just an allophone of a stop. And so because of that substrate feature, you'll often hear more rural and broad Aboriginal accents rendering all fricatives as stops, or most fricatives as stops.
Football is about family. come one together.
There's also in, very broad Aboriginal accents, there's this thing of the goat vowel not being a fronting diphthong, but being a backing diphthong, and saying it more like goat. And that, it sounds weird to a modern ear, but it actually used to be the standard pronunciation of that diphthong. Up until about the 60s, I think, in Australia, that was a fairly common pronunciation, maybe even standard, I'm not quite sure. You hear that very conservative feature a lot in modern Aboriginal accents.
I was diagnosed with mesothelioma in 2016.
And lastly, there are a few things that aren't so dependent on geography or on background, but are more just to do with age. As I talked about in my minutiae video, younger Australians tend to have an allophone of the goose vowel before the letter L, which sounds more like oo. So you get scoot versus school, and goose versus ghoul. And that's mainly a younger thing. People born probably in the first half of the 20th century tend to not have that allophony. They tend to say pool, school, ghoul. There's also the tendency to, with past tense verbs that end in OWN, so grown, shown, known. With verbs like that, the own ending tends to be pronounced as 2 syllables, and this goes back quite recently. People in their 40s do this one. So they'll say known and shown and grown instead of known, shown, grown like I do.
I've blown this whole thing wide open.
But definitely the oldest feature that you hear least nowadays that used to be common is the lock-cloth split. This is the thing that's most common in America. It's very common in the eastern half of the United States. And it used to be quite common, it's stereotypical of Cockney accents of people saying orf and cloth, orf instead of off, and orphan instead of often. I have heard one person do this. In a video about a train in Queensland, I did hear one person, and this is the only Australian in my entire life I've ever heard do this, I did hear one person pronounce off as orf.
Any visitors on board, please step off now as these doors will automatically close.
Big news, guys. I actually did recently meet someone who had something of a lock-cloth split. I went on a family holiday with my girlfriend and met her grandmother, and her grandmother is, I think, in her 70s, and she says orf very regularly, not like a kind of thing. No, every time she says off, she says orf, which is sick. So there you go, update. I have actually met one person in real life who has the lock-cloth split. Again, like I was kind of getting towards in the first recording that I did of this, pretty sure that the lock-cloth split is a very, very, very much dying out feature. Like, I've read a paper that briefly describes, it's from the 60s and it talks about something else, but it briefly talks about Australian English, and it mentions that the lock-cloth split is a feature of older speech. So even in the 1960s, this was an old-fashioned way of talking. There are still a few people who have remnants of the lock-cloth split. A lot of people actually do say gone instead of gone. That's one word where it seems to have survived pretty well. But in terms of other words, like orf is very, very, very rare, and those are the only 2 times I've ever heard it in my life. I think anecdotally it might be more common in Queensland, because Queensland in general has a much more conservative accent than everywhere else. Another thing I forgot to mention before is the short front vowel chain shift. And that is where kit, dress, trap, bath become kit, dress, trap, bath. There's like a very slight rotation in the positions of those front vowels, and also bath for some reason. I'm pretty sure that it would be more accurate to analyze it as a rotation in the kit, dress, trap, and strut vowels, because in Australia the strut and bath vowel are just length distinctions of the same vowel. Now, this chain shift has happened pretty much universally in younger people everywhere except Queensland. For some reason, Queensland is just a little bit behind on every innovation. That's one of the things that sets it apart from other regional accents of Australian English, even in the general accent, is it's got a lot of slightly conservative phonological features. Anyway, yeah, this short front vowel chain shift is mainly seen in younger people. It sort of progresses slowly. As you get younger and younger people, the chain shift is more and more complete.
Another vaguely important thing I forgot to mention, not really that important actually, it's pretty much gone at this point, but there was an old feature of Australian English, definitely broader varieties, and Not necessarily rural, I think it's more common in rural areas, but it was generally characteristic of more broad varieties of Australian English. Words that ended with an O sound, like window, potato, yellow, had their final O sound replaced with an ER. So yellow became yellow, potato became potato, window became window. This seems to have been a dialectal thing that originated in the UK before the divergence of dialects like Australian and American English. And you can tell this because this feature also appears in American English. You hear, I don't know, people from the South, I think, are stereotyped as saying yeller and potato and stuff like that. And I think it's a thing in Philadelphia as well. But either way, this is a thing throughout the English-speaking world in little pockets. And it used to be, I think, relatively common in broader dialects of Australian English. I can only think of 3 examples of it, but they're definitely there. My dad used to call his ute, which was yellow, he used to call it Old Yeller, which, I mean, because it was yellow. This could very well be a reference to the book Old Yeller, because the dog in that is called Old Yeller. But I'm pretty sure the dog in the Old Yeller is also yellow. And so the dog in Old Yeller could be called Old Yeller in the first place because yeller is a dialectal version of the word yellow. Either way, my dad said yeller, right? Then there's this recording of some linguists doing work in, I think, Geraldton in the 1960s. One of them in the background of this recording says potato instead of potato, and he has a fairly broad accent, so that's in the 1960s.
What was a wild potato? There was a wild potato or something too.
Wild potato too, yes.
Also in the 1960s, there's this old newsreel of like interviewing some hoodlums from Sydney, and one of these lads says window instead of window.
One kid got through a window up there.
And so that's 3 examples, and on their own they're not really that, I don't know, you couldn't really surmise much from them on their own, but the fact that they've all occurred together in, you know, relatively old broad dialects of English it says to me that they may be residual features of something that was once more common. I'm just speculating, of course, but I think that that's the case, that replacing a final O with an used to be a more common feature of broader Australian English, but then it's died out, because of course it has. Lastly, we get to the grammar. Australian English has some interesting grammar. There are a few things that are universal, like the past tense of saw, as in like a... How the fuck do you hold a saw? How does that work? The past tense of saw is sawn instead of, I think it's sawed in America, but we say sawn. It's been sawn off. Most of the non-standard features of Australian grammar, though, are exclusive to broader accents. My favourite one is the first-person dative pronoun being us. I think it originated in Scotland. I hear it in Scotland, you know, you can hear it in Limmy's show. And of course, a lot of Scottish people came over to Australia when it was being colonised, and so it seems to have originated from there. And so instead of saying, give me a look, it's give us a look. This is definitely more common in certain phrases. There are some people who use us as the dative first-person pronoun all the time, but most people have it limited to just a certain set of phrases, especially things like give us a look. Stuff like that is really common to hear us in, but in other constructions and circumstances it seems to be more limited to broad dialects. My personal favourite thing is the fact that a lot of broader dialects have this weird thing with the past participle and the past simple, where if... I don't really understand the circumstances fully, but it seems that in a lot of cases, the past participle form of a verb has supplanted the past simple form. I notice this doesn't ever happen if the past participle form has a suffix. And so people might say I seen it instead of I saw it, but I don't think anyone would ever say I taken it instead of I took it. I'll have to look into this further, but I think there might even be like a recent past and then regular past distinction with it, but I'm not too sure. Either way, that's really interesting. Another thing I talked about in the video that I made yonks ago now, where I analysed my own registers of speech, is that in broader accents, conjugations for the plural tend to just be replaced with conjugations for the singular. So, for example, people might say there was 10 of us instead of there were 10 of us. It's a subtle thing that I think is actually very common and even goes into general accents, and it might even be more common outside of Australia. Another phrase it might be used in is use is done for, and that brings me to my next feature, which is use, the second person plural pronoun. In broader Australian dialects, you is singular, whereas use is plural. And I think that's a really cool innovation. I even say use sometimes. And it's not just like, oh, only people in the bush say use. Like, I once had a checkout guy at Aldi who said use.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure how I was dumb enough to mention the Aldi guy instead of this, but I've also met a couple of people in Perth with 6-figure salaries who also say use. That's a lot more. One more feature of Broad English that's actually in common with broader accents in the British Isles is using me instead of my, and also by extension saying me-self instead of myself, but that usually just gets abbreviated to myself. I do this a little bit, but a lot of the time it's difficult to tell whether I do it or not because I shorten both my and me to just m. So I think I kind of fall into a grey zone on this one, and I think a lot of people do as well, where you could be saying me, you could be saying my, but you just say m, so it's ambiguous.
Which brings me to the grammar of Aboriginal English. Again, I'm going to make a whole video on this, so I'm only going to cover a few things here, but it's really interesting. One thing that I noticed when I was quite young was that Indigenous people tend to use the word never in a more loose way than I do. I don't know really how to explain it, so I'll just give you an example sentence that I heard from an Aboriginal guy. I think I was like 11 or 12 or something. But he said, we never went there yesterday. In standard English, that doesn't make any sense. You never went there. That right, you've never been there ever across all of time. And then you add in yesterday, which limits the never to a certain time frame. That's just not something that happens in standard English. My personal favorite feature comes from the vocabulary word that I mentioned ages ago, which was darty. Love darty. Used to say that with my friends all the time in town. Darty and Bale, that was us. But a common way, at least among some Aboriginal people, is to make a sort of construction using darty to show that something's been done well. You say you've done it darty way. When I was at my internship in Geraldton, I was talking to an Aboriginal lady who'd been making a transcript of A Welcome to Country in Wadgery, and she was talking about how she fucked up at the time and only realised later, and she said that at the time she thought she'd done it darty way. Alright, that's all my notes. God's sake, I got that thing again where I've been talking for too long and so my throat starts to hurt. Oh god, I gotta portion myself better when I'm recording shit. Either way, that was me talking about variation amongst Australian English. Hope you like this outfit. I'm wearing it for Pride tomorrow. Western Australia, ignore the fact that I'm not wearing shoes. Western Australia is currently having its Pride Month, and the Pride Parade in Perth is the Perth Pride Parade is happening tomorrow. And so I got this cute little outfit, which I quite like. And I also dyed my hair kind of purple, but since I've got quite dark hair naturally, you can only tell in natural light. Let me just get, holy fuck. Let me just get some natural light in here. Yeah, you can see that my hair is like, I mean, it's not actually showing up that good on camera, but it's kind of similar red to that fucking blanket there. I still don't have an intro. Bye. Okay, I stopped recording, but I feel like that was a bit rude, so I'm just going to say have a nice week on top of that.
By the way, if you are interested in hearing more of the ethnocultural Australian accent, I would really recommend the hit song by $1.80, Driftin' in My Capella. It is available on YouTube and on Spotify, and it's a banger.
When I do a burn, it goes forever. If it goes harder in wet weather, said I'll always be your friend. Yalla, I'ma go sideways round the bend.